Welcome to Japan Unleashed. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Japan Unleashed, where we take a deep look into important issues facing Japan. I'm your host, Parker Allen, President and CEO of Parthenon Japan. Today we kick off Japan Unleashed with the first in a 6-episode series on Japan's regional revitalization. The topic of our discussion today is Japan's energy independence. What can real energy independence provide Japan? Is there a path forward for nuclear energy after the 2011 Fukushima meltdown? What role will the Japanese government play in shaping the country's energy independence? Today we will tackle answering these questions and how Japan's current lack of energy independence is one of the key issues blocking the path to stopping the economic decline of the Japanese countryside. I am joined today by my good friend, fellow Japan specialist, and Parthenon Japan senior advisor, David Wagner. David, thank you so much for being a co-contributor to this series.
Thank you, Parker, and I look forward to our discussion of these important topics facing Japan's path to making rural revitalization a reality.
For those of you who are not familiar with David Wagner, David is a Japan hand who is known as one of the foremost specialists in strategic communication in Asia, with extensive experience in media training, crisis training, and communications consulting for global companies. His work currently includes serving as the go-to media trainer for the Asian Development Bank, Swiss Re, and other Fortune 100 firms, and to date he has conducted over 4,000 media training sessions for spokespeople including top-level executives, ambassadors, and government officials. David has also published 24 books on business communication skills, created and co-hosted a show on business communication skills on Japan's national broadcaster, NHK, and appears regularly on major news outlets as a commentator on Japan affairs. As lifelong learners of Japan, David and I share a passion for analyzing the issues that Japan faces. As you might have guessed, neither of us are Japanese, but we are both long-term permanent residents who deeply care about the future of this country that we call home.
Those familiar with Japan's policy landscape are probably familiar with regional revitalization, which has been a buzzword of sorts for over a decade. However, as we kick off this series, let's start by looking briefly at the rise and fall of the Japanese countryside, which led to the need for regional revitalization in the first place. First, let's take a look at the history a little bit. The population of Japan remained somewhat steady around 30 million people during the Edo period, Japan's last feudal society, which lasted around 300 years from 1603 to 1867. But the Meiji Restoration coincided with a rapidly increasing population that continued throughout the Showa era, through 2 world wars, and kept climbing rapidly through Japan's post-war economic boom and the bubble economy until 1989. By that time, Japan's population had increased by over 400% to 124 million people. However, the beginning of the Heisei era coincided with a stock market crash that led many major corporate juggernauts and banks into insolvency and caused a ripple effect throughout Japanese society. Of course, this diminished both the spirit and the earning power of the Japanese middle class and led to a declining birth rate. Japan's population peaked at 128 million people right around 2010, and that has been on a downtrend ever since.
And there are some projections that population could be almost half by what was it, 2040?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of speculation as a whole, leading down to 48 million 100 years from now. It's really hard to know.
Scary stuff. So, having lived in Japan for the past 16 years, the rapid depopulation of Japan's rural areas was already a consistent theme that I saw firsthand traveling around the country while I was in university. What happened is simple. Beginning with the economic boom and into the bubble era, popular media romanticized city life. And those young people who made it into Japan's top universities and then joined major companies were able to enjoy the dream of a successful life in the big city. Then the pace of this trend accelerated even more after the economic crash of 1989, which hurt rural communities the worst and led many young people to head for metropolitan areas like Tokyo and Osaka in search of gainful employment. By the 2000s, in most rural areas, few young people stayed in their local community beyond high school, and rural depopulation devolved into a serious problem across Japan. More background behind what led to the rapid rise and sudden downfall of rural Japan is available on the Parthenon Japan blog, which is easily accessible on our website at parthenonjapan.com/blog, or by simply doing a Google search for Parthenon Japan.
Regional revitalization, a term coined by the late Prime Minister Abe at a press conference in 2014, encompasses a movement to bring people back to the countryside in order to remedy the current dilemma that Japan faces where major cities are overcrowded. Japan's countryside has more or less become cities, towns, and villages full of shuttered shops, abandoned houses, and a graying population with a lack of doctors and caretakers and an uncertain future. The problem of depopulation is not unique to Japan, but there are several key issues that make Japan's situation more complicated and dire, and which must be addressed if the Japanese state is to continue on a positive, sustainable trajectory.
Complicated stuff, eh? Well, this series has been designed to explain some of the myriad issues surrounding the regional revitalization conversation and share some of our own ideas on what can be done to remedy this negative spiral.
So the main topic of today's episode is Japan's energy independence. It might not sound like a topic that relates to rural economics, but it is extremely important. Rural economies rely on cheap energy, whether their main industry is agriculture or manufacturing. And actually, Japan was energy independent for over 2,000 years up until the early 1900s. But as a nation with limited local energy resources, it began importing crude oil from overseas in the 1920s. And Japan's energy self-sufficiency has been on a downward trend ever since. Japan relies on imported fossil fuels, such as oil, natural gas, and coal, to meet its energy needs. It has a significant amount of nuclear power generation, but following the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in 2011, many reactors were taken offline, and the government has recently been promoting a shift back to nuclear and also towards renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, and hydroelectric power. However, these sources still account for a relatively small portion of the country's overall energy mix. And today, Japan relies on fossil fuels for over 75% of its energy, which is almost 100% sourced from overseas. Of course, this severely hinders Japan's ability to meet its ambitious CO2 reduction goals, but also hurts rural communities, where the largest industry is agriculture, which is severely vulnerable to rising energy costs and the threat of an unstable supply. I'll start off with the issue of energy independence as a whole. What can real energy independence provide Japan? Well, firstly, let's talk about the economics and the economic benefits of it. By reducing reliance on imported fossil fuels, Japan is sure to save money on energy costs and reduce its trade deficit. One would think so, actually, but that brings up the petrodollar issue. It costs Japan a lot to pay for the energy it uses in US dollars. One wonders if it won't be long before Japan tells its suppliers it wants to pay for everything in yen. Saudi Arabia and Russia are openly discussing non-US dollar options. But on the topic of cost of renewable energy itself, it's getting more competitive, partly as a result of high oil and gas costs. In order to lure more investment in renewables, costs need to come down, especially initial costs like land acquisition and processing equipment. Parker, you have any thoughts?
Yes, it's a really difficult issue because obviously there's so much conversation about this shift to renewables, but it is a lot of talk around the world. And when you actually look at actions, real progress taking place, both Japan and the United States are kind of in the same boat. There's lots of talk about renewables in both countries, but in both countries, over 70% of their energy is sourced from fossil fuels. So even if you're driving an EV, you're not actually being that sustainable because the electricity that you're using to drive that EV is coming from fossil fuels.
Of course, when we talk about energy, the United States has a distinct advantage over Japan because it has its own oil and gas where Japan does not. But that doesn't address, as you note, the EV and the renewable issue as a whole. Anyway, there are clear national security benefits, and these things need to be talked about. Energy independence can reduce Japan's vulnerability to supply disruptions and price volatility caused by geopolitical conflicts or even natural disasters. You know, there's a lot to discuss here when we talk about geopolitics. Taiwan, North Korea, China, Russia, to name a few. It's been interesting to watch the war in the Ukraine in terms of how Russia has reacted to Japan related to projects such as the Sakhalin project in northern Japan. I was surprised that both Mitsubishi and Mitsui continue to want to be involved in that project. But then there's other issues, for example, environmental benefits to having renewable energy. By reducing dependence on fossil fuels, Japan can decrease its greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, which might improve public health and reduce the impact of climate change overall. But does anybody really think participating nations like Japan will hit COP27 emission reduction targets in the first place? I'm not really sure Japan will. But again, there are real cost efficiencies to be had now that oil and gas costs are up. It makes things like experimenting with storage capacity and battery density more feasible. That is a main hurdle in really getting renewables on a scalable basis. So what about strategic benefits? Energy independence provides greater flexibility in areas like foreign policy and could offer leverage in international negotiations. Certainly in energy discussions, that is key. Japan has committed publicly to specific targets, so its prestige and legal commitments are on the line. Japan has a clear 2030 emission reduction target, and also to become carbon neutral by 2050, when renewables should be a major energy source. To do that, Japan needs to double solar and wind power by 2030 if it is going to hit its stated target of 36 to 38% renewable power by 2030. Japan can do this by enabling producers to sell their products more easily. Government policy revisions will help. Parker, you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, this is also so very complicated, but obviously something that the government is looking at very seriously. Of course, when it comes to COP27, I totally agree with you that these ambitious targets seem almost impossible to achieve given the current situation. I think that governments around the world have been very vocal about their support of renewables, but when it comes to actually getting renewables as a major energy source, countries with large populations and high energy consumption just don't have the wherewithal, the impetus, or the technology isn't there. I think there's a confluence of factors that is hindering this to become a reality. So what can the government do? Of course, there is the ability for Japan to spend more on innovation around renewable technology. There is also the opportunity for Japan to look abroad to see what kind of new global technologies it might be able to harness. And I think there's actually a lot of options in the toolkit, but the question is, will the government go for it? And of course, we haven't even addressed what Japan could do domestically.
Well, there's a lot going on, and there are definite technological benefits. I mean, developing domestic energy sources will surely lead to additional innovation, which can create jobs in industries related to energy and unrelated, and improve overall competitiveness. There's a continuing challenge of innovation and risk-taking in Japan. We know that stakeholders in Japan are known to be more conservative in nature. That is not to say that there is no innovation or risk-taking here, but we know the limits of group consensus formation in terms of time-efficient decision-making as a whole.
And that, of course, is deeply connected to the government conversation as well, because at the end of the day, if Japan is going to make swift changes to shift towards renewables, it needs leadership at the top levels, also at the legislative level, and also at the administrative level. But we continue to be hindered by this focus on scandals and politics and, political horse trading. And within the bureaucracy, you have a very siloed system where ministries aren't talking to each other openly enough, and something like energy obviously is the bailiwick of MITI, or the Japan Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, but there's also the Japan Ministry of the Environment and other stakeholders like the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism. And I'm sure there are other ministries who also have a role in making this actually happen.
I think the key question is, are they working together or working apart? And we have the siloed Japan ministry issue, which is pretty well known, right? So I think there's overlap, and some ministries seem to be moving in the same direction. I think the idea is to stimulate the regional areas, and that's where they're moving in the same direction.
Yes, and we haven't even talked about the fact that when it comes to science and technology, that's another ministry too.
That's right. Yeah, endless ministries. And I think one of the themes we're going to come across pretty consistently in this series is that decision-making takes too much time in this country, not across the board and not in all cases, but it doesn't move quickly enough, and it hurts competition. And that ultimately is a drag on getting the economy to stimulate.
Yes, of course. And especially people looking outside Japan at the Japanese situation might say, well, why doesn't the prime minister do something about it? Why doesn't the minister of so-and-so do something about it? And the answer is, while, of course, these are the leaders of the nation, at the end of the day, it's the bureaucracy that has to lay the groundwork. Japan can be actually very bottom-up in that sense, which is both a gift and a curse. The Japanese ministries are, of course, influenced by policy decisions, and they move based on what the legislature creates as new policy, but they're also sort of moving on their own based on what they think is the right direction to go in.
Well, this is going back to policy decision-making and the history of the evolution of the Iron Triangle, where you have administrative government, business organizations, and politicians working in the same direction.
Yeah, and I think we had more of that in the good old days of the 70s and 80s when Japan was having, of course, its high-growth economic period. But I feel like we've sort of lost that cohesiveness that was once there. And to credit the Japanese government in another sense, the problems are so much more difficult, so much more complicated, and so much more global than they were back then.
Yeah, absolutely. The challenges are great on all levels. I don't know what to say, Parker. The research that I've done to make this series, and I'm not an expert on energy development and energy independence, but it strikes me that there's a lot being done outside Japan that's coming in. And there's a lot being done in terms of policy initiatives inside Japan. But I don't know how much they're working in concert. That's something I didn't find a lot of information on.
Well, while the benefits are clear, as we have alluded to already, Japan faces several challenges in achieving energy independence. We touched on this earlier, but Japan has very, very limited domestic energy resources. Japan has very few natural resources, so of course it must import most of its energy, making it very vulnerable to disruptions in supply.
And this is certainly the case leading up to World War II and the 1970s with the Middle East oil embargo. With renewables, this should become less of an issue over time.
There is also the elephant in the room that is nuclear power. Japan could have a heavier reliance on nuclear power, and in fact, Japan relied on nuclear power as its principal source of renewable energy right up until the Fukushima disaster in 2011. If I remember correctly, around then, nuclear accounted for about 30% of Japan's energy mix. Not anymore.
That's right. But there's great talk of renewing that, restarting some of these idled plants. And on the issue of technologies, smaller and even more portable nuclear power generation is under development and certainly under discussion. And that really brings us back to the idea of nuclear energy. I mean, it's historically played a significant role in Japan's energy mix, as we've discussed. Prior to 2011 and the Fukushima disaster, nuclear actually accounted for about 30% of all electric generation in Japan. The disaster in 2011 caused many reactors to be taken offline for safety inspections, et cetera. As a result, the countries had to rely more heavily on fossil fuels, natural gas, and even coal. And that has been revisited again as a problem, but also as a solution for the time being because the nuclear plants are basically not operating. As of 2021, nuclear energy accounted for about 4 or 5% of the country's total electrical generation. So, question, should aging reactors be started? I say yes and no. Are safety standards effective? Not only existing plant equipment, but security to protect plants from potential sabotage. These are key questions that need to be answered. What do you think, Parker?
On the nuclear issue that is nuclear, I think that it is unavoidable that these nuclear power plants need to be restarted, obviously, if they pass the safety inspections. And the reason is clear. Japan has an energy crisis. We've had situations as recently as last year where Japan was almost at full capacity in some areas for, having blackouts.
Last summer, yeah.
Yeah. And that could happen again. And so we really can't toy around with this issue that is, are we going to use this energy source or not? The fact of the matter is, even a shut down nuclear plant is dangerous. It's just a matter of whether or not it's generating power or not.
Well, another danger is where they're located, and several nuclear plants in Japan are located on known earthquake faults. I mean, what were they thinking when they designed these things? So, should reactors operating on or near earthquake faults be restarted? I say no. Fukushima is the main reason why, and that's the end of the story. What on earth were they thinking when they designed these reactors 50 plus years ago? And on top of it, they put backup generators in the basement, which could be flooded by tsunami water. I mean, incredible lack of foresight and lack of flexibility in looking at options.
If you look at the nuclear power plants around Japan, you'll notice that they're almost all on the coastline. And
that's because of water availability, right?
Yeah. Well, not just that, but also I think there's a NIMBY issue, not in my backyard. I think people would oppose a nuclear power plant in their local community. So the Japanese government, not wanting to ruffle any feathers, put them sort of as far away from people as possible, i.e. on the coast where there isn't a port, there isn't really anything, and they could more or less create the power plant without a lot of local public opposition. I think that was politically convenient at the time, but obviously they didn't think about the other side of the equation that we now know all too well.
Well, there was old technology at the time. It was innovative, right? It was cutting edge, but it's 50 years old in some cases. And now there's smaller and even more portable nuclear reactors being developed. There's a company in the States called NuScale Power, which sells modular light water reactors. So, Japan might want to develop similar technology.
Or just import what's already working. I feel like we're beating a dead horse here, but how does Japan plan to increase its dependence on nuclear power in the wake of the Fukushima disaster?
Well, as we know, Japan's government and its initial plan at that time was to phase out nuclear power overall. And that's, as we said, being reconsidered. The government has shifted its stance and is now looking to increase the role of nuclear power as concerns of energy security, and the high cost of fossil fuels is increasing. But at the same time, Japan has been developing newer technologies such as advanced boiling water reactors and fast breeder reactors, which are considered to be safer and more efficient than the older designs. So my views are nuclear, yes, expand its role in meeting Japan's needs, yes, but with newer technology that has a proven track record.
And it would also be nice if they were in historically safer areas.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed.
Also, what role does Japan play in the development and use of hydrogen fuel in the future? Hydrogen is in its infancy. 1% hydrogen generation by 2030 is the stated target. Again, limited storage capacity is an issue, but hydrogen policies are being discussed and a comprehensive framework is under development, as are incentives for clean hydrogen and coal firing. Harmonization of hydrogen safety is also being explored. Consistent safety regulations are not synthesized yet. Once done more, investment will be necessary.
Yes, and probably will be there. You took the words right out of my mouth, Parker.
One interesting thing that just came up on the news, Honda has developed new fuel cell technology, which of course is related to hydrogen power, which it says is 3 times more efficient than the previous technology that was available. So while hydrogen seems like this pipe dream that Japan has really sort of had as its baby, but we haven't really seen a lot of big sweeping movements, all of a sudden Honda comes out with this amazing new technology. I don't know how widely they can develop it and how quickly it can become a power source, but it is a very exciting and happy development and an otherwise dark conversation I think we've been having.
Yeah, well, I would put my money on that development of that new resource has been decades in the making. It's just probably being publicly released now.
Also, we have to talk about how Japan is going to address its energy security needs in the face of increasing competition for natural resources.
Well, more national debate is needed. For example, how can the government and industry create more desire by consumers to use green energy? And then there's still a great internal debate on where and how solar energy can and should be used, for example, onshore and offshore. Solar development is not currently growing in Japan, and it's not growing because investors have fled. How can we lure them back? I think, land and friendlier regulations, the availability of those two things will be one step forward.
Well, this has been a great discussion, and honestly, we're left with more questions than answers. However, while this is a complex topic with no easy solution, I hope we have got you thinking about it. I think that in conclusion, what Japan needs to do is clear, but the path is uncertain. Without more energy independence, Japan's rural areas, which are already facing an uncertain economic future, are going to suffer the most from higher energy prices. This is a basic but crucial issue that must be solved in order to realize sustainable development towards revitalization of Japan's rural communities.
I totally agree. And if there's one takeaway from this discussion I can make, it is that Japan needs more ideas and more technologies, both from within Japan and with or in conjunction with global firms, which can help find solutions to this important issue.
Thank you so much, David. I, for one, am optimistic that Japan will continue to seek and find new solutions toward energy independence, but the big issue is speed. We talked about this. The issue of Japan's energy independence and the once viable but no longer politically feasible option of nuclear has been clear since the Fukushima disaster in 2011. That was over a decade ago.
That's right. A lot has changed, but a lot hasn't. And I still think public sentiment is basically against restarting existing nuclear power plants. You know, in 2011, I remember when the protests were going on against nuclear power, 180,000 people, I think, in one march alone in, I think it was August of 2011. But it's petered out comparatively. And I think, the restarts are more acceptable, even though there's a lot of anti-nuclear sentiment from the older generation.
And I'll never forget, of course, hearing your story of seeing how poor the English communication was right after the Fukushima disaster, and literally raising your hand and going in to help with the government communications after the disaster.
Yeah, that was a great opportunity to help Japan, and I was happy to have been able to do it.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening to Japan Unleashed. Stay tuned for our next episode, due out in 2 weeks, where we will be discussing Japan's real estate realities and how that ties into rural revitalization. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to Japan Unleashed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks again for listening to Japan Unleashed. See you soon.